Hello, everyone, and welcome to this conversation with David Bacon and Councilman Kevin de León and Ignacio Ornelas Rodriguez. We are here to celebrate and mark the exhibit of David Bacon's wonderful photography and the exhibit that's online entitled Movements for Change in California. My name is Michael Keller. I'm the University Librarian and Vice Provost at Stanford University. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this event. It's been a journey of wonderment to be working with David Bacon over some years, principally by Roberto Trujillo, our Associate University Librarian and Director of Special Collections, and his talented associates and colleagues, starting with Ben Stone and going through Deidre Fuzel, who's largely responsible both for the lovely work on the catalog of this exhibition and the David Bacon photographic collection of about 200,000 images from his entire lifetime in the movement for social justice and for labor in social justice. We're delighted to be the steward, the perpetual steward of this collection, and we will have it here at Stanford forever in support of research and teaching, and really for enlightenment about the meaning of all of this great activist work in support of people who make it possible to live the lives that we live, often without having the same privileges that many of us have. Today, we're going to have three panelists, starting, of course, with David himself, our good friend. David is a California-based photographer, though I know he was born on the East Coast. He is a writer, a social activist, and union organizer. He has dedicated most of his career to documenting labor history and documenting the lives and social movements of migrants, farm workers, and communities impacted by globalization. He began working, however, as an independent photographer in the 1980s, having had experience as a person who worked with his hands very productively, however, as all of us try to do now and again. He has written several books and numerous articles about migration. His most recent book of photographs and oral histories, In the Fields of the North, en los Campos del Norte, was published by the University of California Press and the Colegio de Frontera Norte in Tijuana in 2017. We are delighted to have you with us, David, and we're delighted to welcome you as a colleague and friend with all of us. The second speaker is Kevin de León, who is President pro tempore emeritus of the California State Senate and the Los Angeles City Council member for the 14th District. As leader of the Senate, he delivered landmark gun safety legislation, clean energy mandates, environmental protections, and immigration reform. He is truly one of us. Before politics, Senator de León served the public as a community organizer, taught English as a second language, and U.S. citizenship courses. He advocated for public schools as well. He was elected to the Los Angeles City Council in March of 2020 by an overwhelming majority and will take office on 15 October. That means you've been in office, right? And finally, Ignacio Ornelas Rodriguez, Ph.D., is a historian who conducts research on civil rights, social justice movements, and electoral politics. He works in the Department of Special Collections and University Archives at Stanford, where he is most welcome to stay with us. Here's what we're going to be doing. We are having this conversation with these three gentlemen to commemorate the opening of the exhibition Work and Social Justice, the David Bacon Photography Archive at Stanford. These talks will explore social justice movements in California, including advocacy and electoral politics. David Bacon's photography captured social movements in California during an economic transformation. As the state entered an economic recession in the 1990s, labor unions witnessed major losses and wages for workers stagnated. During this period, California also witnessed nativist and anti-immigrant sentiment across the state. Labor leaders organized strategically and led large protests, Most notably, millions marched to protest the rhetoric in 1994 and 2006. David's photography captured the labor, the movement, the organizers who led the immigrants' rights movement. During the 1990s and 2000s, former labor organizers ran for electoral office and won powerful legislative positions. Los Angeles City Councilman and former President pro tempore of the Senate of California, Senator Kevin De León was a leading labor organizer and immigrants' rights advocate from 1989 to 96. De León eventually entered electoral politics, becoming the first Latino to be elected President pro tempore of the California Senate office in over 100 years. Welcome to you all, gentlemen, and I invite you to start with you, David. Please.
First, I just want to say that I really appreciate, Kevin, that you took time out of a schedule that I know how busy it must be as a city council member in LA to spend time with us talking about photographs and the history of movements of LA. And I also want to thank Stanford. There's a catalog that goes with this show. It's Stanford, Tiardra, Ignacio, Roberto, you, Mike, Ben, you've all done a wonderful job, and I thank you for that. So with that, let's start.
Okay, gents, who's going to go off first?
Let me begin actually by thanking Mike Keller. Mike, thank you for the introduction and for your work supporting the preservation of civil rights and social justice archives over the decades. The Stanford University Department of Special Collections has a long distinguished record of preserving the scholarship of civil rights, social justice organizations, and advocates. Thanks to the work of the director, Roberto Trujillo, who has been at Stanford for some 37 years acquiring collections, and curator Ben Stone, who are making sure to preserve this remarkable history. Thank you. Notable records here at Stanford include the works of the Mexican American Legal and Education Fund, MALDEF, California Rural Legal Assistance, CRLA, the Ernesto Galarza papers, the Bert Corona papers, the Cherie Moraga papers, the Bob Fitch Photography Archive. And we are here today to talk about a newly acquired collection that captures international imagery of social justice and civil rights causes, the David Bacon Photography Archive, currently available for research through the Stanford Library's online Spotlight exhibit, and soon for greater access as it is made available. This work is available for research to Stanford students and faculty, but also the international community. During today's webinar, we will discuss social movements in David Bacon's archive, specifically the immigrant rights and labor movements in California. We're lucky to be here with David, but we're also privileged to have Councilman Kevin De León, who spent years organizing for immigrant and labor rights in California. Councilman Kevin De León became the first Latino to serve as the president of the California Senate in over 100 years. He has also passed landmark legislation to protect immigrants in California, and SB 100, which has made California the leader in the environmental movement. Thomas Friedman recently of the New York Times called Councilman Kevin De León, quote, an unsung hero of the green movement. Thank you, gentlemen. Let me begin by asking David about the archive coming to Stanford. David, why Stanford, and what has been the process of making the archive available for research and teaching?
I was introduced to the library at Stanford by Bob Fitch, who also has his archive there. And Bob and I are similar photographers in the sense that we both look at ourselves as being organizers and participants in the social movements where we're taking the photographs. And so because Stanford had become the repository for Bob's images and also made them available to the world in a very accessible way, it seemed a very appropriate place. Plus, there are people whose archives you mentioned, Ignacio, that Bert Corona has his archive at Stanford, and I've always looked at Bert Corona with enormous admiration. He was really the father of the modern immigrant rights movement, and I've been a participant in that movement for many, many years, 40 years, and I knew Bert, and it was an honor that these photographs would go into the same repository that held his papers. I think that they are, in a way, they give people a way of looking at the history of the immigrant rights movement, in particular in California, both visually and also in terms of his own history and his own thought and writings.
Councilman, you have been reviewing your writings over the years, editorials, your memos of advocating for immigrant rights over the years. This is not a new movement for you. How does a photography archive reveal stories that are missing, lost in the text-based primary sources?
Well, a couple things. One, Nacho, thank you very much for the very kind introduction of my person. I also want to thank Michael Keller, also for co-introducing me and to the great, Roberto Trujillo, as our assistant university librarian at Stanford University. I want to thank you very much for what you do with Ignacio, the intentionality, that sense of purpose of going out of your way proactively to make sure that the voices and the faces in the writings of the rich diversity, that beautiful mosaic of the greatest state in the world, the state of California, and other parts of the country are actually archived and known, not just for students at Stanford University, but for scholars and non-scholars alike. And to be with someone like David Bacon today to share, oftentimes we would say, to share the same stage or the same room, to share the same Zoom, platform is a huge treat for me, because to the essence of your question, Nacho, it is absolutely crucial. It is everything, especially for those communities, working families that historically, as well as politically, have been marginalized by the political institutions, by the very powerful economic institutions. If their face, su rostro, if their voices are not heard and captured by photography and archived and shown for the rest of the world, then their stories, will never be known. They won't be heard, no matter how righteous that struggle is, and that struggle for immigrant rights, for those who work under a brutal sun every single day to feed the country, to feed the world as farm workers, for single immigrant mothers like my mother, who was a housekeeper, a hotel worker, who take care of the wealthy, who clean hotels in the wealthiest enclaves in the world, being in California, whether you live in Palo Alto, whether you live in Sausalito, Hillsboro, Atherton, or down in La Jolla, California, or Bella or Malibu. These are oftentimes the stories that are never shared. These are women, immigrants, people of color, who are largely invisible to the large political, powerful institutions that permeate society as a whole. And that's why David Bacon's role is absolutely critical. That's why, what he brings, truth to power by the power of photography is so essential. We may know the story, but if the David Bacons of this world don't demonstrate and convey that story to the rest of society, oftentimes it'd be like finding a cure, for some sort of cancer in a cave and keeping it secret and not letting anyone know about it, And obviously we deal with all the political obstacles that are put before us, but that's why the power of David Bacon's photography is absolutely critical for the well-being, the human condition for all individuals, regardless of who you are and where you come from.
David, speaking of social justice and the history of civil rights movements here in California, how does your archive reveal interconnections between different movements for social justice and civil rights, which may sometimes be elusive to track?
Well, I think that one of the things that the archive does, and this is sort of takes off on what you were just saying, Kevin, is that it tries to show a little bit of the history of where we come from. And because it's a photographic archive, it does this in visual terms. But we're used to thinking of California as being a very progressive place, and it is, but we were not always that way. And it took a lot of struggle for us to get where we are today. And so the archive contains part of that history. No one person could obviously, document more than what an individual can see with their own eyes and their own camera. But there are pieces of it that I think are important, especially when we look at the transformation. I think especially the transformation of Los Angeles, because when I was a boy, Los Angeles's mayor was Sam Yorty, who was a very conservative right-wing politician. And we all looked in the labor movement as Los Angeles as being, the home of the open shop. And now Los Angeles is one of the most pro-union towns in the country. And it has people in office like you, Kevin, who are kind of like a model or an example for the rest of the country of what progressive politics can mean in office. So when I look into the archive and I think about, well, okay, what does this show us about LA? It shows us, first of all, the hard work that you were referring to, Kevin. There's images in here of Denora Galdames, who was a housekeeper at the Beverly Hilton, doing what that work is, and tries to show in very intimate terms kind of what it feels like to make those beds and those huge heavy mattresses and lift them up 16 times a day for each room. It shows the changing demographics. There's a whole series of kids in school. There was a certain critical moment, I think it was in the 90s, Kevin, when the population of the school district, the students in the Los Angeles Unified School District, became a majority Latino. And that was a very important moment because it showed the changing in the diversity and the changing demographics, but then also what happened to people as a result of that. People who were on the bottom doing Denora's job, the students in the schools, we remember the blowouts, right? We remember the protests that went on. So there was one in particular that I documented because this was a strike in Pomona at a huge factory called Cal Spas that was led by another hero of the immigrant rights movement, Humberto Camacho, who was my boss. I was an organizer on that strike. And I took my camera and I tried to take pictures that would show what an immigrant-based strike in Los Angeles looked like and felt like to the participants, sort of from the beginning to the end. And so that's in there. You mentioned Proposition 187. That was a critical thing that happened because as a result of people's looking at, what it meant in LA to say that somebody without papers was going to be a felon, a federal felon, that was, I think, what encouraged lots of people to become citizens and to vote and eventually to pour out into the streets. And we saw in 2006 when there were 2 marches in Los Angeles, each one of them with 1 million people. That provided a base for the politics to change. And of course, you were a participant in all of that, Kevin, and better than anyone what those political campaigns were based on. And the last thing in the archive were these images from the LA sports arena in, what was it? I think it was 1998 when the AFL-CIO changed its position on immigration and became very pro-immigrant. And we have people like Hilda Solis and Miguel Contreras and Bert speaking at this event, essentially celebrating what happened to our unions and what happened to our labor movement, and as a result of that, what happened to our politics.
And let me ask you, let me move to that actually, Councilman De Leon. During the early 1990s, you were one of the leaders that organized across California to counter this anti-immigrant rhetoric across the state. Could you take us to 1994 and your work countering Proposition 187 and that campaign that took place to the historic marches in Los Angeles and across California?
Well, thank you, Ignacio, and thank you, David, for the references. Humberto Camacho, Bert Corona, historic legend figures that I had the opportunity to know and work with. For me, as Ignacio, as the youngest child of a single immigrant mother with and I think I want to point this out because today is National Latina Equal Pay Day. Latinas in California earn 43 cents on the dollar. And my mother being a single mother with a third grade education, a woman worked her fingers to the bone, cleaning homes in the wealthy enclave with the ocean panoramic views of the Pacific Ocean in La Jolla, which is a community on top of the hill next to UCSD in San Diego, in the city of San Diego. So my mother was a housekeeper, a hotel worker in Coronado Hotel, as well as the Valencia in the La Jolla Cove, a village area of La Jolla, and she took care of the very elderly. And this was a woman who was both mother and father, who paid the roof over my head, the clothes on my back, and the food on the table. So this Latina woman with a third grade education, and by the way, and Nacho, as you know, David and everyone else, my story is not original, nor is it unique, because my story is a story of millions of young men and women, older men and women who have experienced the trials and tribulations of growing up in society that continues to be stratified based on your ethnicity, the color of your skin, which God you love, that you pray to, who you love, and yes, your legal status. So for me, Prop 187 was for baby boomers, for example, a watershed moment in their lives is perhaps the Vietnam War. It is Nixon and Watergate. Me being Generation X, for me, my watershed moment was Proposition 187. The very fact that we had the demise of the former Soviet Union, the thawing of the Cold War, that the Department of Defense, the Pentagon budget had shrunken incredibly so, and that California, but especially Southern California, was home to a large defense, industrial complex, aerospace enduring. All of a sudden, the economy went into a really deep economic recession. And as a result, people lost jobs, they lost hope, they lost faith, and they were losing their homes and their families. So there was a huge movement to say, hey, you know what? This is the fault of immigrants. This is the fault of undocumented immigrants. This is the fault of those immigrants who are cleaning homes in Bel Air or in Palo Alto or Menlo Park or down in La Jolla. It is their fault that we're in a deep economic recession. And we're going to move forward a ballot that's going to prohibit young boys and girls from entering our public schools, from folks receiving health care in our state clinics or state hospitals. And the very idea that this could be a ballot initiative for the whole state of California to vote on was beyond stunning. So that's where I cut my teeth politically, being one of a handful of organizers of what was then the largest march in the history of California, which had 150,000 people attend that march. I know David was there taking photography and recording this history. It was a watershed moment for us, and we were roundly criticized, not just by the right, but we were criticized within the mainstream left as well too, as why are you going to be provocative and go out there and poke your finger in the eye of the electorate with having so many Latinos marching together? In this case, they were marching with Mexican flags. Well, ignorance is bliss back in the day. How do we know? We would have asked folks, hey, can you take an American flag, a US, a Mexican flag? But what people don't understand, Ignacio, is that Prop 187 would have passed, period, even if we had US flags, because the rhetoric, the sentiment, and the politicians that would use the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, the pillar of our economy as a scapegoat for all the economic, political, and social ills of society as a whole. And it gave me a window to what David said, which is, spot on, that we are a very progressive state, relatively speaking, but that's not always been the case, because California has always been home to Prop 187, Prop 209, what repealed affirmative action, anti-bilingual education, the very idea that the electorate as a whole would be voting on matters of pedagogy, Prop 227, the fact that the state of California was home, the legislative body that I was the leader of your California State Senate, that legislative body, along with the Assembly and the governor of California, moved forward the first Chinese Exclusion Act, the first measure of its nation. Then it became federal level in Washington, D.C. by the U.S. Senator at that time of the state of California. So we have not always been in a progressive state, actually far from it. And we have exported not just the good, but we've exported the good, the bad, as well as the ugly to other, states throughout the country. So it is the human condition and how we fight for the human condition, especially during Prop 187, which lastly I'll say on this issue was Prop 187. If anything, the silver lining in that very dark, mean-spirited, pernicious cloud was a new generation of leaders that rose from the ashes, phoenix rising from the ash, to say we need to occupy positions of power if we're going to move policies with purpose to improve the human condition for the most vulnerable, for the most marginalized. Because when we do, we're not taking from you to give to them. As we become much more inclusive, we're lifting everyone together and have a much more inclusive, diverse works for everybody, not just somebody. And that's why it's absolutely critical. And we see what's happening today with coronavirus. We've always had these deep fissures underneath the surface, but they're much more raw, they're much more ugly because they've been exposed, these deep inequities in society, even in a progressive state like California.
Yeah,
Well,
that's very true, Kevin. And responding even more directly to your original question, Nacho, I was looking at some of these photographs in the archive yesterday, and I was looking at photographs of a march that took place against what was then called CCRI, the California Civil Rights Initiative, which led to Prop 209. We ought to be really well aware of this because we're trying to repeal Prop 209 on the ballot this year. When Prop 209 was the proposition that tried to outlaw affirmative action in California. What's interesting, though, is that these marches against CCRI and against what was to become 209 were marches also against Proposition 187, which was on the ballot. These were very close together in time. And so you see photographs with Jesse Jackson and African-American people marching against CCRI, of Asian Americans against CCRI. And then in the same march, you see No on 187, for the rights of immigrants, against deportations. So there was this very unifying process that happened of people of color, especially, who were the targets of these initiatives, getting together in these marches and demonstrations and saying, well, okay, we understand as people what the impact of these propositions is going to be on all of us here. And there were anti-labor propositions that went on the ballot in that period as well, too, that tried to restrict the growing power of unions, because unions were a part of this broad kind of political front. So these photographs, you can see in the photographs, the colors of people's skin, of the banners that people brought in these demonstrations, and the flag thing. I'm glad you talked about that one, Kevin, because I remember that controversy. And in these marches, in some of the marches, you see people holding Mexican flags with these very angry expressions on their faces, as though you could hear their voices saying, this is part of our culture and we are not going to give it up. And then you have other people holding US flags, and you hear the voice coming from the image of people saying, this is our country too. And so it was really, I think, a very important part of what those marches did, that people were holding both flags and also defying the accepted wisdom that said, not only shouldn't you have a Mexican flag in the march, you really shouldn't be marching at all. And so you can see what the reaction of people at the base was, and thank goodness people did do that, because that is what changed us, I think.
Councilman, at the policy level, and you've been very involved, obviously, for many years on the ground and passing historic legislation, but it's a different generation. It's a generation of young people who are on social media. A question specifically about archives and research and the kind of impact that photographic historical record may have on contemporary social activism. and political initiatives. So how does an archive, what kind of impact does a photographic historical record have on contemporary social activism and political initiatives?
Our history is very important. Our history has to be cataloged. Our history has to be archived, and it is the photography of an incredible storyteller like David Bacon that helps inform future generations who may be struggling for social justice, economic justice. It helps inform our decision making when you have powerful imagery that's captured, in these photographs like David's. And so it doesn't make a difference if, for example, you're a baby boomer, photographer. The photography that you've captured, in the 80s, in the 90s, in the early 2000s, that helps inform, future generations who are incredible with social media platforms. Whether it is, Twitter or Instagram, Facebook, and there's a lot others, right now that I've just learned about, that is powerful, that social media platform and the imagery that's captured in the past, that's part of our history. It's who we are, and it helps inform, whether you're a community activist, whether you're in a position of some type of political power that you can exercise to move policy, whether you're a politician or not a politician, because you don't have to be a politician to hold power. You can hold power in so many different ways, but it really informs our decision making. It really informs, how we view and perceive the world, which is so critical.
David, you were obviously very involved in the civil rights movement, social justice movements. A similar question: what is the value of a historical archive, and how important is it for social justice movements?
Well, I think it's very important for us to know where we come from, and also know how we got what we have. Again, here we are trying to essentially repeal Proposition 209, but I think that it's important for people to know what Proposition 209 was and the kind of political role that it played, because it was an attempt to divide people, and an attempt to pit people against each other, as you were saying in your earlier remarks, Kevin. So the fact that we fought against this, the fact that we were able to overcome that, I think that's a very important part of our history. And the archive helps to show that. Sometimes it helps to see it as well as to read about it. And so, here we're looking on the screen at Cesar Chavez, and this photograph was taken out in front of a Safeway store in San Francisco. And Cesar is basically picketing Safeway to get them to stop selling grapes because it was part of the grape boycott. And I think it's important for us to know not just who Cesar was and treat him as a hero. Of course he was a hero, but to also know some of the ideas that he contributed. And the boycott was an important one of those ideas. He said that we can get justice for farm workers who, after all, are working and living a long ways away from metropolitan LA or metropolitan San Francisco, if people living in cities and people living out in rural areas can get together. And so the boycott was a way in which actually we got together. It was a way in which people working and living in cities could do something very concrete to help people get a living wage and get protection from pesticides out in the countryside. So that petition that Cesar's holding there is a petition about pesticides. It's trying to get big agricultural corporations to stop using pesticides, and they're still out there, those chemicals are still out there, to stop using them because it was hurting farm workers, and at the same time it was hurting consumers because it was on what we were eating. So the fact that those boycotts existed, and the fact that we had some success in those boycotts, the Farm Workers Union got contracts out of that, and certain pesticides, owing to the pressure of the boycott, were banned by the legislature. I know that you were in the legislature, Kevin, when some of that happened, when we banned some and we tried to get other ones, methyl bromide and other ones banned as well too. So these photographs are kind of like visual evidence of how we organize, and also that organizing works, that we can achieve very important things as a result of that.
These photographs are just very fascinating, and just what an incredible contribution to the historical record, Councilman. These photographs really, for me as a historian, as I analyze the period, right, early 1990s, I go back to almost passing of the torch to a new generation of young social justice activists, right? That we go from a generation of social justice advocates that were very involved in the labor movement and the movement with the United Farm Workers, with legal organizations like MALDIF and CRLA. How were you influenced as you take on the torch in the early 90s as an advocate for immigrants? But how were you influenced by these earlier movements, whether it's Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez, or others?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and we have such incredible, advocates and iconic figures in the civil rights movement, in the labor movement. Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, Martin Luther King Jr., David mentioned Bert Corona from Hermandad Mexicana Nacional. And where I cut my teeth politically, and the influence that had the largest impact on me, without a doubt, and I go back to was Prop 187. It was my mother, as a single mother, and admittedly, growing up with my mother, not having a deep, full appreciation of who she is and the role that she played in protecting me, in raising me under all the obstacles, under all the racism, under all the way society viewed her as a Latina woman, and so many women like her. And you don't have the analytical skills, you don't have maturity until you grow up, and your horizons are broadened when you get to university, and you're able to juxtapose and analyze and grow as a result, have a deeper appreciation. Suffice it to say, when I get to university, I'm not a stellar academic student. First quarter, second quarter, third quarter, I was on academic probation, and eventually my financial aid was withdrawn and I was effectively kicked out of school. So, it was for me a moment where I had to find myself and find inspiration and motivation from, leaders who could help, chart out a pathway of how to be resilient, how to struggle, how to be persistent, and going back again, it was Prop 187 that for me was a watershed moment that really ignited this fire from within me about human and civil rights, about dignity, and simply about respect and in opportunity for all individuals, again, regardless of who you are and where you come from, and having a really deep, profound appreciation for the immigrant condition. And this is very important to me at a very personal level, Nacho, because oftentimes immigrants, even today, 2020, even among progressives, are sort of kind of viewed as secondary, or an appendage, part of a larger movement, but kind of there, Immigrants are a pillar of our GDP. We're the 5th largest economy on planet Earth. There's only 4 economies larger than that of the state of California. It is the United States of America in the aggregate. It is China, Japan, Germany, and then our own golden state, California. So our GDP is larger than the United Kingdom, France, India, Italy, Brazil, and Vladimir Putin's Russia, to put this in context. And when you disaggregate the economy, you see how much of an impact that Latinos and Latino immigrants, especially Latino women, play, in our economy. Oftentimes they're just marginalized and not dignified and elevated in the role that they deserve to be recognized. And that's why, being, again, the youngest child, of a single immigrant mother, the powerful imagery that David has captured, that you have archived, thank you to you and Roberto Trujillo and the other decision makers making this happen, making it come to fruition at an institution like Stanford, is so critical. And and for me, that was something that was very, very powerful. Having the ability to work with Humberto Camacho, you make reference to Cal Spas and Pomona, Cristina Vasquez, one of the leaders there as well too. Fabian Nunez, who became the Speaker of the California State Assembly, was an organizer there at Cal Spas as well. Those were sort of not my contemporaries per se, older generation, but those were folks that I kind of looked up to and with admiration and inspiration and motivation to become the person who I am. Now, obviously, history will judge me as an elected and non-elected and what my works are to society as a whole. They'll be the judge of that. But that to me was very powerful and had a huge impact on me.
David, let me ask you specifically a labor question. I am just fascinated by your work. It helps historians, it helps us teach, it helps us take individuals to the work itself. We have a photograph here of a young woman, a hardworking individual, having to make decisions over seconds on how to make a cut, to cut a piece of lettuce with a very, very sharp knife, having to stoop over hundreds of times over a day, considering the elements, the climate, the weather, right? Sometimes working in rain or very high temperatures. The skill involved, can you just briefly talk before we get to questions here from the audience, talk about what your photographs tell us about the skills involved in this working class work?
Well, the woman who is cutting lettuce here, as you say, Nacho, she has to make a lot of decisions when she is doing this. First of all, she has to pick the head of lettuce that is going to sell in the market from one that won't. So she has to be able to see it. Also, if you pick lettuce at the wrong time of day, when it's too cold, for instance, and there's ice inside the lettuce, when you grab the head of lettuce, you'll crush the ice inside the head and it will wilt on the inside. Then you have to take that head of lettuce and you have to, in her case, she's going to bag it in a plastic bag and then put it in a box, and the box will get shipped out to the supermarket. So she's packing as she's working. And this is all skill that's acquired through experience. That's how you learn to do it. And you have to learn to do it not just, in the photograph, I'm trying to show you in a very intimate way kind of what it looks like and what it feels like, her examining the head of lettuce. But you can also imagine that she is doing this very quickly. She is actually almost running down the row. And so each decision is made very quickly. And she has to bend over all day in order to do it. When I left the union as an organizer, I was an organizer for the United Farm Workers for a number of years. And when I left the union, I didn't have any money. And so I did what seemed to make sense at the time. I went to work in the fields for about a year. And the first job I had was trying to pick strawberries. And the fact that you have to bend over as far as you do and then work so quickly, as we see this guy here, and here in his back pocket, he's got the card that keeps track of how many boxes, because people are paid by the piece rate. Part of their pay is a bonus per box. And so if you don't work fast, you can't earn enough to live on. So you're bending over like this, working fast. I couldn't do it for more than a couple of weeks. I had to go and change crops. I had to go and work cutting wine grapes, where you can work kind of standing up, at least a lot of the time. So doing this work is something that requires a lot of physical stamina. It requires your ability to endure physical pain, and it requires your intelligence. People think that working out in the fields doesn't require a brain, and that's absolutely untrue. People have to use a lot of their brain power, a lot of their decision-making power in order to do this, and growers depend on it, and they know that that it takes a very good worker, very intelligent, decision-making, and physically capable worker to do this kind of work. And sometimes doing it, like you see the wheel on the cart here with all the mud covering it, this worker is working in the middle of the mud. And so it's also something that causes physical problems, because if you work in the cold mud, wet, day after day after day after day, year after year, you get arthritis in your hands, for instance, and in your legs. And so there's a physical cost to doing this work that I don't think that we pay enough attention to, because we should have very generous and expensive medical plans and retirement plans that allow people to get out of the fields when this happens to them, as a way of saying thank you for the work that you're doing. And instead, we have a throwaway culture that basically says, if you aren't capable of doing this work tomorrow morning, you're gone and we'll find somebody else to do it in your place. And so these photographs are trying to sort of also say to you, as the person looking at them, if you appreciate what's going on here, then you need to do something in your political life and in your life as a citizen, as your life as a participating member of our society here, to ensure that we all have a better life, specifically looking at the problems of farm workers, trying to ensure that people have the basic things that we think are necessary for that life, which include, health protection, which include decent wages for doing it, and also an ability to stop doing it when you get old and you can't do it any longer, and you can enjoy your retirement and people respect you for the work that you've done.
I'm going to open it up to some chat room audience questions. First question for Councilman De León. Councilman, do you see parallels between 1994 California and 2020 US politics? Do you think it may lead to the same political outcome?
There's no question about it. I think, and to be a little political and partisan with regards to the current status of the Republican Party in California, which is virtually a party that has shrunken so badly because of 187. What 187 did was, you had a sizable, undocumented population who eventually became legal permanent residents in the United States and eventually naturalized U.S. citizens, and now an electoral political force changing the makeup of our political institutions, not just in heavily populated Latino neighborhoods, but in non heavily majority Latino populated neighborhoods throughout California. So what we see happening in 1994 is playing itself out in 2016 and fast forward to 2020. So what does that bode, for the Republican Party at a national level, with more Latinos, living in states that historically had a very small presence of Latinos, whether it be Iowa, whether it be North Carolina, South Carolina, whether it be other red battleground states, red states. My own brother-in-law used to work up in Iowa in the slaughterhouse, and it was primarily all, if not exclusive, Latinos and Latino immigrants, and a good majority of them undocumented immigrants. So how this plays out in California at a national level, and the parallels to the question there is spot on target. And I can see the beginning of the end. In other words, you want short-term gain, a Pyrrhic victory that will come at a very high cost. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm not wishing any political party its own demise. What I just say is, regardless of your political affiliation, your party, you should never espouse, anti-immigrant rhetoric to score cheap political points, because you cannot be able to figure out how to communicate to the electorate as a whole why economically we're in the situation that we're in, the complex arcane factors that have nothing to do with people of color or the presence of undocumented workers or immigrant workers who are actually lifting the economy up. And one last thing I want to add to this is that, we're seeing it play itself out with undocumented workers today in California who are not eligible for unemployment insurance from the state of California. We're not eligible for federal dollars, the HEROES Act or the CARES Act, because of Donald Trump's edict. However, what we see undocumented workers who are actually subsidizing US-born residents and naturalized citizens who are not able to receive anything in return. And they are standing in modern day soup-lined kitchens akin to the Great Depression of 1929, receiving, boxes of food. And without that food, they can't maintain, because those who've been hit the hardest during the coronavirus are those at the lowest economic strata. And it's shameful, again, that in LA, for example, in one of the richest cities, clearly in the wealthiest state, in the wealthiest nation in the world, we have so many immigrants who are barely surviving. They're holding on by a shoestring.
Another question for David. Previous photographers during the civil rights movement, a few that you mentioned, Bob Fitch, others like Matt Herron, George Ballas, that were very, what you would call activist photographers. Do you see yourself as an activist photographer?
I certainly do. They were part of a very important tradition of photographers who saw the work that they did as photographers as work that would help to move forward the social movements that they were involved in taking photographs of. And this goes back in California, especially back a long ways. There were photographers in the 1930s like Otto Hegel and Hansel Meath, who were refugees who fled Germany during the time of Nazism, who became farm workers and then photographers here, documenting the strikes of farm workers, and then the longshore workers when they had the general strikes on the coast in the 1930s. They were photographers like that. Ballas was. He took pictures, he and Bob Fitch both took pictures during the civil rights struggles in the South for SNCC, for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and then came to California and took photographs during the grape strike in the 1960s and the strikes that followed, as being people that thought that their photographs would help the rest of the world understand what was happening in Delano and support it. And so that's the tradition that I feel that my work is part of. And I also thank them for doing the work that they did, because we all are standing on the shoulders of the people who came before us, and I am too.
Councilman, again, as a historian, as someone who studies society a lot, the history, I read speeches. I study speeches by elected officials. There are a few out there, but there's a few like yourself who really take into account women's labor, that have a conscious and awareness and empathy for the kind of work that women do. Can you talk about that? Where are you? You spoke about obviously your mother's influence, but you do have a passion for making audiences aware, the public aware of the importance of working class labor, women's work specifically.
Well, I think, Ignacio, for me is, I grew up in a largely female household. My mother, my tia, who's my aunt, older sister to my mother, who's like my second mother, my half sisters, and my grandmother. So I largely grew up in an all-female household. So for me, that was very normal. It wasn't until I went to college, to university, that I remember a friend of mine had said, "You didn't grow up with a father, did you?" And I always thought that was a very odd question to ask. And I asked him, "Why would you ask me such a question?" He says, "Because you never mentioned any male figure in your life." And it never occurred to me, the old adage that ignorance is bliss, is so true, because I thought the environment I grew up in was quite normal. And it is normal, for a lot of young folks who grew up with single mothers. But that had a huge impact on me, and it's helped inform my decision making as a policymaker, as a lawmaker, because our society continues to be deeply inequitable. Without question, women in general have been marginalized historically, but even within women, it is women of color and Latina women who are at the very, very bottom. And obviously, my mother being a Latina woman, that's had a huge impact on me. I sent out a tweet today with the picture of my mother, because it's National Latina, or it's Latina Equal Pay Day. And I was thinking, in high school, I probably didn't have to live in a frickin' basement next to the alley on 16th Street had my mother been paid a living wage. And that's why I grew up. And by the way, I didn't grow up in Delano. I didn't grow up in Sanger, or Selma in the Central Valley. I grew up in San Diego, California. I grew up in an urban environment, in Logan Heights, and in this case, on 16th Street. So that's really had a huge impact on my life. And obviously things are not even Steven, they're not equal. So that's why you continue to advocate until we have a society that is much more equitable, because when we do, that means everybody wins, everybody. So if you live in Atherton, you know, or if you live in East San Jose or in Fruitvale, or if you live in East LA or in Bel Air, we all win when we have a much more inclusive, equitable society.
David, we got about 30 seconds. Anything else that we should know about your archive that we did not, in 30 seconds, that we should look to in the coming months?
I think that the archive is an important historical and social document that I hope serves the purposes of our movements for justice here. And so I hope that people will look into the archive and find things that are useful for them in it and go out there and change the world.
I want to take a moment to thank all of the staff members who have worked on this project, especially Deirdre Fazell, Curator Ben Stone, and the Director of the Department of Special Collections, Roberto Trujillo, who works tirelessly to make this research available to Stanford students, faculty, and the international community. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to Councilman Kevin León for your friendship to Stanford University over the years. David Bacon, congratulations for establishing your legacy for posterity here at Stanford. This concludes our webinar, and have a great afternoon, and please make sure to vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Ignacio. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you, Michael.